He had only been living in the lakeside neighborhood for a few months when things began to feel strange. At first, he didn't pay much attention to the letters that arrived in his mailbox because he assumed they were general notices the community sent to everyone. But when he opened the first one, he realized it wasn't a friendly welcome message or an introduction. It was a warning. The letter claimed he had violated community lake use rules and needed to correct his behavior immediately. He stared at it for a long moment, confused. He hadn't even stepped into the lake since the day he moved in. He had walked along the path once or twice, but he never imagined that simply being near the water could cause trouble. He folded the letter and placed it on his kitchen table, trying not to let it ruin his evening. Maybe it was a mistake? Maybe they sent it to the wrong person. Mistakes happen, so he let it go. But only 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one had a heavier tone, telling him that further infractions would result in fines. And just like before, the accusation made no sense. It said he had disturbed the natural shoreline of the lake. He had no idea what that even meant. He had barely learned the layout of the community, let alone done anything to disturb anything. He decided to stop by the HOA office the following morning to clear things up. He expected a simple conversation, a quick correction, maybe even an apology for the mix-up. But the moment he walked into the small building by the community gate, he realized he had stepped into a place where friendliness didn't exist. 3 people sat behind a long table, most like a panel. They didn't smile. One of them, a man who carried himself like he was the boss of the world, didn't even look up from his papers when he asked what the issue was. The new homeowner introduced himself and explained the letters he had received. He expected surprise or at least mild confusion, but instead the board members exchanged a quick glance, and the man who seemed to be the president leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Well," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child, "you're new here. Maybe you aren't familiar with how this community works." "I'm trying to understand," the homeowner replied calmly. "That's why I'm here." The president gave a sharp smile that didn't look friendly at all. "The lake and its surroundings are under HOA authority. We monitor everything that happens around it. If a resident breaks a rule, we address it immediately." "But I haven't broken any rules," the homeowner said. "I haven't even used the lake." Another board member, a woman who sat with her arms crossed tightly, cut in. "We've had reports. Maybe you don't remember what you did," stared at them, unsure whether they were joking or serious. How could someone forget disturbing a shoreline? How could someone forget breaking a rule they never knew existed? There was no point arguing. He realized quickly that they weren't interested in listening. So he politely thanked them for their time and left as he walked back home. He noticed a few neighbors watching him from their yards. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. They simply looked at him with that quiet curiosity people have when they notice something unusual happening but don't want to get involved. The next week, things got worse. He received a third letter, this time much more aggressive. It stated that he was now on a probationary watch, whatever that meant, and that any further violations could escalate to heavy financial penalties. They also reminded him that the HOA had the right to restrict lake privileges if they deemed his behavior harmful to the community. He held the letter in his hand. Baffled. He hadn't stepped into the lake. He hadn't even touched the water. He didn't understand how they had come to the conclusion that he was some threat to the shoreline. The entire thing felt unreal. Later that evening, while taking a short walk through the neighborhood, he overheard 2 residents talking quietly near the mailboxes. They didn't realize he was behind them until he got close enough to hear one of them whisper, "He's the new guy the HOA's been targeting. They're trying to make an example." The moment they saw him, they fell silent and avoided eye contact. One of them muttered a polite greeting, but their nervous expression told him enough. Whatever reputation the HOA was spreading about him was already reaching other homes. He wanted to confront the board, but he knew that arguing with people who didn't want to listen rarely leads anywhere. Instead, he decided he'd be patient. He'd watch. He'd try to understand what was really going on. A few days later, during the weekend, he noticed the HOA had put up temporary signs near the lake. They were bright orange, with bold letters that warned residents not to trespass into protected lake zones. The wording seemed strange because, as far as he knew, every resident had the right to walk around the lake, but something told him the signs were meant for him. He walked slowly along the path, keeping to himself. A couple of neighbors gave him small apologetic smiles, as if they felt bad for him but were too afraid to say anything. He didn't blame them. He had already sensed something heavy in the air, a fear that seemed to hang over the entire community. Whenever the topic of the HOA came up, later that afternoon, he received an email invitation announcing the next HOA meeting. The message insisted that all residents must attend, though he had heard from a few people earlier that attendance was usually low. Most residents didn't go because the board rarely allowed anyone else to speak. Still, something told him he should go, not because he wanted to argue, but because he needed to understand the type of people who were running the place. When the day of the meeting arrived, he walked into the community hall and immediately felt the tense atmosphere. People were scattered among the chairs, whispering quietly. The board sat at the front, ready to begin. The president cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. "Let's get started. We've had several issues involving misuse of lake property this month," he announced. Pausing just long enough for everyone to guess who he meant, the homeowner sat quietly, feeling every eye slowly drifting toward him. The president continued, "We cannot tolerate behavior that threatens the lake's condition. We've dealt with similar issues before, but this recent case is especially concerning." He didn't mention the homeowner's name, but he didn't need to. Everyone understood. Then the president began listing vague accusations: unauthorized shoreline access, disturbance of wildlife, improper walking routes. The list grew longer, each claim more ridiculous than the last. The homeowner waited until the president paused for breath, then raised his hand politely. The room went still. "Yes," the president said, barely hiding his annoyance. "I want to clarify something," the homeowner said in a calm, even voice. "Every accusation you just mentioned, I haven't done any of it. Not one thing. I haven't touched the lake since moving in." A few residents nodded quietly, impressed with his courage to speak, but the president leaned forward, smirking slightly. "Are you saying you're being falsely accused?" "I'm saying none of the claims match anything I've done," the homeowner replied, "and I'd like to know who is reporting these things." "That information is confidential," the president snapped. The homeowner stayed calm. "Then perhaps you could show me evidence? Photos? Videos? Witness statements?" The president's face tightened. "We handle enforcement internally. We don't need your approval." He nodded slowly, realizing something important. They were not only refusing to provide proof, they also never expected him to question them. He wasn't supposed to challenge them. He was supposed to shrink back, pay the fines, stay silent like everyone else seemed to. But he wasn't built like that. Before he could say anything more, the president dismissed the conversation entirely. "We're moving on. This matter is closed." The rest of the meeting dragged on, mostly the HOA lecturing residents about new rules, updated fees, and vague threats about what would happen if anyone stepped out of line. The homeowners around him looked tired, defeated, and used to this sort of treatment. After the meeting ended, an older resident approached him cautiously. She glanced around before speaking, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I'm sorry about how they treated you," she whispered. "You're not the first." He looked at her with concern. "Has this happened to you too?" She nodded. "And many others. But people don't fight back. They're scared. The board uses the lake to control everyone. They think owning the lake gives them power, even though, well, it's complicated." He wanted to ask what she meant, but she suddenly stopped talking when she noticed one of the board members watching her from the doorway. She gave the homeowner a quick, worried smile and walked away. That night, he sat alone at his dining table, reading the letters again, replaying the meeting in his mind. Nothing made sense. The accusations were made up. The hostility was unnecessary. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized something important. The HOA wasn't warning him about anything. They were challenging him, trying to break him early, trying to show him that they ran the neighborhood, not the residents. He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window, where the moonlight reflected softly off the lake. Something about the water looked peaceful, calm, untouched, the exact opposite of the chaos the HOA claimed he had caused. For a moment, he wondered why the board seemed so eager to target someone who had done nothing at all. Was it because he was new? Or was it because they thought he would be easy to control? Whatever the reason, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let fear decide how he lived. He didn't know yet that the lake he was being accused of disturbing wasn't theirs to control. He didn't know yet that he held something in his hands that would flip the entire community upside down. He didn't know yet that the story the HOA was trying to write for him would soon transform into something far bigger than they ever imagined. But that moment was coming. It was coming fast, and when it arrived, the HOA would finally understand the truth they had been blindly ignoring. He wasn't the one trespassing, they were. The next few days felt heavier than before. It was as if the HOA had decided that silence from him meant guilt, and they were ready to push harder. Every morning when he walked out to check his mailbox, he wondered what new accusation he would find waiting for him. And sure enough, the letters kept coming. One morning, there was a notice saying he had walked too close to the protected grass line. Another day they accused him of causing waste runoff into the lake. A claim so absurd that he couldn't even figure out what they were referring to. He didn't water his backyard in any unusual way. He didn't dump anything outside. He didn't even have pets. It became clear that the HOA wasn't interested in truth. They were interested in pressure. The community started reacting too. Some residents avoided him completely, as if afraid that standing next to him might get them into trouble. Others offered him quiet nods, little gestures that said, "I'm sorry for what's happening." Few whispered short messages when no one was watching. One evening, when he was taking out his trash, a man from the house across the street approached him cautiously, glancing around like someone checking for surveillance. "Look," the man said in a soft voice, "I'm not trying to get involved, but they did the same thing to my sister when she moved in. They fined her for months until she stopped asking questions." He asked. The neighbor hesitated. "About the lake? About who actually owns it?" The words made him pause. "What do you mean?" But before the neighbor could say more, an HOA patrol golf cart rolled around the corner, and the man backed away instantly, pretending he had just been out for an evening walk. He gave a small, nervous wave and hurried home. The homeowner stood there for several moments, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The lake again. Everything the HOA did seemed connected to it somehow. The signs, the warnings, the fake infractions, they all revolved around that stretch of calm water. He looked toward the lake, its surface resting quietly under the moonlight. It didn't look dangerous or fragile or in need of strict control. It looked peaceful. So why did the board act like it was their most guarded treasure? The very next day, the HOA escalated things. A new letter arrived, not folded in an envelope this time, but taped to his front door. The paper was more formal than the others, stamped with the HOA logo. It ordered him to attend a mandatory evaluation meeting regarding his behavior and compliance level. He let out a tired breath. It was clear they weren't going to stop. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. When he arrived at the HOA building, he found the same 3 board members waiting for him. Their expressions were stern, almost rehearsed, like they had planned every word they were about to say. The president motioned for him to sit, and the moment he did, the lecture began. "We've reviewed your recent actions," the president said, "and we believe your pattern of non-cooperation is affecting the community." He raised an eyebrow. "Non-cooperation. All I've asked for is proof of these accusations." "That's not how we do things here," the president replied sharply. "The HOA is responsible for maintaining order. When we say there's a problem, there's a problem." The homeowner felt frustration rise in his chest, but he held on to his calm. "You're accusing me of things that never happened. I just want to understand who is reporting these so-called incidents." The woman on the board leaned forward. "Our sources are reliable." "Then show me the evidence." "That information is confidential," she repeated, just like she had at the first meeting. He stared at them quietly. Their avoidance was too obvious now. They weren't protecting a source. They were protecting themselves. Then the third board member, a man who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. "You should know," he said in a measured tone, "that we have the right to limit your access to the lake if you continue with this attitude." The president nodded. "We can restrict you from walking the path or going near the shoreline." The homeowner finally understood. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about infractions. This was about power. They believed the lake gave them control, and anyone questioning that control became a threat. He thought about leaving the meeting then and there, but something told him to stay and listen. So he let the board talk. They listed more invented accusations, told him he should learn the culture, and insisted he follow their instructions without question. When the meeting ended, he thanked them politely, walked outside, and let the cool air settle on his face. He didn't feel defeated. He felt something else now, a slow, quiet determination. On his way home, he took the long path around the lake. He wanted to think. He wanted to understand. And he wanted to see what it was about this water that made the HOA feel like they owned the world. The lake was beautiful in the late afternoon. Birds floated on the surface. A gentle breeze moved the branches. The sunlight reflected in soft ripples. Nothing about it looked like the tense battlefield the board made it out to be as he walked. An older man sitting on a bench waved at him. He recognized him from around the neighborhood, a friendly-looking resident who always smiled politely. "You're the one they've been fussing about," the man said with a chuckle when he approached. He didn't know how to respond. "I guess so," he said. The older man shook his head. "Don't take it personally. They like to intimidate the new folks, especially the ones who move into homes that are close to the lake." "Why the lake?" the homeowner asked. The old man gave a short laugh. "Because it's their pride, their symbol of authority. They think they own it. They think," he repeated. The man looked around, making sure no one was nearby. "The HOA acts like the lake is theirs. They collect fees for it, talk about it like they built it, and control it like it's the crown of the neighborhood." The homeowner raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it theirs?" The old man shook his head slowly. "That's the funny part. No one really knows. The HOA never shows the paperwork. They just say it's theirs and everyone believes it." He felt something shift inside him, a small spark of curiosity that quickly grew stronger. But someone must own it. "Oh, someone does," the older man said. "Every piece of land has an owner. But the HOA keeps everything so secret that people stopped asking questions." A rustle behind them made the man stand up suddenly. An HOA volunteer in a bright vest was walking nearby. The older resident mumbled a polite goodbye and hurried off. Not wanting to attract unwanted attention, the homeowner watched him leave, puzzled but thoughtful. Something about the conversation stuck with him. The way the man talked, the way he seemed scared to be overheard, the way he mentioned ownership without details. That night, he sat at his dining table again. Instead of staring at warning letters, he opened the folder he had received when he bought his home. Inside were the usual things: sale documents, inspection reports, community maps. He flipped through them one by one until something unusual caught his eye. An old survey map. He unfolded it carefully. It was yellowed at the edges, older than the rest of the papers. The map outlined property lines of the area from decades ago. He scanned it closely, trying to understand the territorial markings, and that was when he saw something that made his heart pause for a moment. The lake was labeled differently than the rest of the neighborhood. It wasn't colored the same. It wasn't marked as community property. Instead, it had a note next to it: Lot L27 Private Holding Company registered. He stared at the name of the company. His breath caught. It was familiar. It was the name of the small investment company his late father once ran. A company he inherited years ago, even though he had never used it for anything. He had assumed it held nothing valuable, just left over. Paperwork from his father's work life. His hands shook slightly as he dug through the remaining documents in the folder. He found another sheet referencing water maintenance rights. Another referencing property taxes. The lake's parcel number showed up again and again. It didn't make sense. Why would the lake be listed under a company his father owned? Why had no one ever told him? Why did the HOA act like they were the owners? He pulled out his phone and searched for the parcel number on the county's property database. He typed it in, pressed search, and waited when the result appeared. He felt a rush of disbelief wash over him. The lake was privately owned, and the owner listed was the company his father left behind, which meant the current legal owner was him. He leaned back slowly, staring at the screen. Everything that had happened finally began to make sense. The accusations, the hostility, the intimidation, the secrecy. The HOA had built their power on a lake they didn't own. A lake they charged fees for. A lake they used to scare residents. They weren't the rightful authority, and they were terrified of anyone who might challenge that illusion. He closed the laptop gently, feeling a mix of shock and clarity. The HOA had tried to silence him, but now he understood something they never expected. Him to discover he wasn't the outsider causing problems. He was the actual owner of the very thing they depended on, and they had no idea yet. He woke up the next morning with the same thought pressing in his mind: the lake belonged to him. No matter how many times he repeated it internally, it still felt unreal. The HOA had acted so confidently, so aggressively, that imagining them being wrong, completely wrong, almost felt impossible. Yet the documents were clear. The county records were clear. The old map was clear. He wasn't imagining anything. The lake that they had lectured him about. The lake they charged everyone monthly fees for. The lake they used to control the whole neighborhood. It wasn't theirs. He decided he needed to confirm the information again. Not because he doubted himself, but because he knew the next steps had to be taken carefully. He didn't want to become reckless out of excitement or anger. He wanted to think like his father would have: calm, quiet, strategic. He found the number for the county assessor's office and called. The woman who answered looked up the parcel number and repeated exactly what he had seen the night before. The property was registered under the old company his father had created, and since he was the sole inheritor, that meant everything in that company fell to him. He thanked her and hung up, feeling the truth settle deeper inside his chest. After a long moment of stillness, he stood up from the dining table and walked to the window. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, peaceful and calm as always. But now, every ripple carried a different meaning. The HOA didn't own this water. He did every inch of it, every shore, every blade of grass on its boundary. For a while, he didn't move. He simply watched the water and thought about the strange journey of the past few weeks. The harassment, the accusations, the threats. All of it was coming from people who had built their authority on something that didn't legally belong to them. He wondered what they would do once they found out. Later that afternoon, he walked to his mailbox and found yet another HOA notice. This one accused him of unapproved social gatherings near the lake. He laughed softly at the absurdity of it. He had not invited anyone to his property since moving in, let alone held gatherings. It was clear the HOA was becoming desperate to corner him. He didn't open the letter fully. He didn't need to. Simply folded it and placed it in a drawer with all the other ridiculous notices. He knew he had to stay patient and pick the right moment to reveal what he knew. But before he could do anything, something unexpected happened. Later that evening, as he returned from a short walk, he noticed 3 HOA volunteers standing near his driveway. They weren't smiling. They weren't pretending to check anything. They were waiting for him. One of them stepped forward, a young man with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "We need to talk to you," he said without greeting. The homeowner kept his expression calm. "About what now?" "You've been ignoring our compliance letters," the volunteer said. "That's becoming a serious issue. The board asked us to monitor your activities more closely." He felt a quiet spark of annoyance, but didn't show it. "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's not up to you to decide," the volunteer replied in a firm tone. "Until the board clears you, you're not permitted near the lake. And why is that? Because you're under investigation." He stared at the 3 of them, realizing they truly thought they had full authority, not just over the lake, but over him personally. They looked like soldiers ready to follow orders, not neighbors who shared a community. He spoke gently, not wanting to escalate the situation. "I understand you're doing your job, but you should know something." He stopped himself. It wasn't the right moment. Telling volunteers would only create panic that would spread to the board in a twisted form. He needed to address the board directly. Instead, he simply said, "I'm not violating anything. You can report that." The volunteers exchanged annoyed looks but didn't push further. They walked away, whispering among themselves. Once they were out of sight, he sighed. It was clear the HOA was preparing for something. And if they were preparing, he needed to be ready too. The next morning, he drove to the county records office. He wanted printed copies of everything related to the lake ownership documents. Tax records, historical maps, maintenance logs, anything he could gather. The clerk printed a thick stack of papers and placed them in a large envelope. He thanked her and carried the envelope to his car, feeling like he was holding the truth itself. When he returned home, he spread the documents across his table. The evidence was overwhelming. The lake wasn't just in his father's company's name. It had been for decades, long before the HOA was created. The HOA had no legal right to the lake, no authority to charge fees for it, no power to enforce rules around it. Everything they were doing was built on the assumption that no one would ever question them. And for years, no one had. But now, someone did. He spent hours reading through the old paperwork. He saw how his father had bought the land long ago when the area was still undeveloped. He saw how the neighborhood had slowly formed around the lake afterward. The company had remained dormant, unnoticed, its records collecting dust. No one thought to check who owned the lake because the HOA simply acted like they did as evening arrived. He stepped out onto his porch, thinking deeply. The quiet streets, the soft glow of porch lights, the distant sound of crickets, all of it felt strangely different now. He wasn't just a resident. He was the one person in the entire neighborhood who held the truth about the lake. He knew he had to reveal it soon. But the question was how. He didn't want to embarrass anyone. He didn't want to start a fight. He didn't want the community to turn into a battlefield between him and the board. What he wanted was simple: honesty and fairness. Yet he already knew the board was not the kind of group that would handle the truth gracefully. The next day, while he was outside trimming a few small plants in his yard, someone approached him again. It was the older woman who had spoken to him after the first meeting. The one who warned him the board had treated many others the same way. She looked around carefully before stepping closer. "I heard the board plans to do something at the next meeting," she whispered. He looked at her with concern. "What kind of something? They want to vote on restricting your access to certain areas? They're saying you're becoming a disturbance." He sighed quietly. "I haven't done anything. I know," she said. "Everyone with common sense knows, but most residents are too scared to challenge them." He nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." She offered a small smile. "I don't like unfairness. Something about this feels very wrong." After she left, he sat down on the small bench outside his porch and stared at the lake. He felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet strength. He was done reacting. It was time to act. When the day of the next HOA meeting arrived, he walked to the community hall with the envelope of documents tucked under his arm. He didn't feel nervous. If anything, he felt strangely calm, like everything was finally falling into place. The room was filled with residents, more than usual. It seemed word had spread that something dramatic might happen. People whispered amongst themselves, stealing glances at him as he entered. He offered polite nods, but didn't speak. At the front, the board was already seated. The president cleared his throat and began speaking in his usual stern tone. "We need to address an ongoing issue regarding one resident who continues to disregard our community rules." He didn't flinch when nearly every face turned toward him. The president continued, "We have documented several violations, and we believe restrictions are necessary to protect the community's interests. Before we vote, we will allow the resident to respond." Finally, the moment. He stood up calmly, holding the envelope in his hand. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. Simply walked toward the front and stood where everyone could see him. "First," said in a steady voice, "I want to say that I have respected every resident here since the day I moved in. I've never broken any rule. Every accusation made against me has been false." A small wave of murmurs moved through the crowd. The president leaned forward. "We've already discussed this, the evidence. He held up the envelope. Actually, speaking of evidence, I brought some too. That made the room fall completely silent. He continued, the board has claimed repeatedly that I'm disturbing the lake, that I'm breaking lake rules, that I'm using property that belongs to the HOA. He paused, letting the tension build before speaking again. But the lake doesn't belong to the HOA. Gasps filled the room immediately. The board member stiffened. He opened the envelope and pulled out the documents, placing them on a small table so residents in the front row could see. These are county records. These are ownership documents. This is the survey map from when the land was first purchased. The lake was bought decades ago by a private company. He looked straight at the president, and I'm the legal owner of that company. The room erupted. Some people were shocked. Some whispered loudly. Others leaned forward, wanting to examine the papers more closely. The president's face turned pale. This must be a mistake. Not, the homeowner said softly. I confirmed everything. Twice, the lake was never transferred to the HOA. You have no legal claim to it. The woman on the board looked furious. That's impossible. We collect fees. We maintain it. He nodded. Yes, you collect fees. But you're collecting them for a property you don't own. A resident from the audience stood up. So you're telling us we've been paying money for nothing? The homeowner shook his head gently. Not nothing. You've been paying for a lake that the HOA has no authority over. Two more residents stood up, demanding answers. Others turned to each other in confusion, frustration, and disbelief. The president tried to regain control. This meeting is not the place for. It is exactly the place, a resident snapped. If we've been paying for years for something they don't own, we deserve to know. The homeowner didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack anyone. He simply stated the truth. For weeks I was accused, threatened, and targeted. And all along, the board didn't even own the thing they were trying to control me with. The board members looked lost, like their entire foundation had just been ripped away. He continued, I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not even here to embarrass the board. I just want honesty and fairness. The residents listened intently. I plan to work with the community so everyone can enjoy the lake properly. But from now on, the HOA cannot threaten people with something they don't own. The room was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, everything changed. The meeting was held on a warm evening, the kind where the sun sets slowly and paints the sky a soft orange. People gathered in the small community hall near the entrance of the neighborhood. It was the same building where every complaint, every rule, and every fine seemed to come from. Even from outside, the sound of voices carried through the doors. It was clear the crowd was bigger than usual. Everyone had heard that the HOA planned to address repeated violations. Most people assumed it would target the same man. They'd been bothering for weeks. He arrived a little earlier than the start time. Not because he was eager, but because he wanted to find a seat near the back. He didn't enjoy attention, and he wasn't the type who walked into a room expecting to make a scene. He simply carried a folder under his arm, wore a calm expression, and nodded quietly at neighbors who gave him small, sympathetic smiles. Many of them had faced the HOA's heavy-handed behavior, and though they didn't dare speak against the board, they understood what he had been going through inside. The hall was brightly lit with slightly flickering ceiling lights. Rows of simple plastic chairs were lined up in front of a long folding table where the HOA board members sat. The board president sat in the middle, tapping a pen against a clipboard as if preparing a speech. To his left and right were the other board members, their expressions stiff and overconfident, like they had no doubt they would once again control the narrative. People whispered among themselves as the man took his seat. He didn't look nervous, but focused. The folder he held stayed gently rested on his knee, as if he knew exactly what was inside and exactly what it would mean. The clock reached the hour, and the board president cleared his throat dramatically. That was his habit, making every meeting sound more important than it actually was. The room fell quiet. The president spoke in a tone that suggested he enjoyed the attention. Good evening, everyone, he said. We have a number of matters to discuss tonight. But before we move to general issues, we need to address an ongoing situation involving one of our residents who has repeatedly ignored community rules. Several heads turned toward the man. Though no one said anything out loud, some felt sorry for him. Others were curious about what would happen next. A few were simply tired of the HOA's constant attempts to micromanage everything. The president continued. This resident has accessed restricted property without permission, ignored written notices, and refused to comply with the rules we have set in place for the protection and order of this community. The man stayed quiet, watching the president with a composed expression. He didn't fidget, didn't argue, and didn't even look irritated. That quiet confidence only seemed to bother the president more, who went on, raising his voice slightly as if trying to provoke a reaction. As a result, the president said, the board has decided that a temporary suspension of Lake's privileges may be necessary, as well as additional fines if these violations continue. A murmur ran through the crowd. People shifted in their seats. A couple exchanged glances that seemed to say, this doesn't feel right. But no one dared say anything yet. Speaking up against the HOA usually meant becoming the next target. The president then looked directly at the man for the first time. Sir, he said with forced politeness, if you would like to make a statement, you may do so now. But I urge you to understand that the rules apply to everyone. The man slowly stood up. He wasn't tall or intimidating. He didn't look like someone who came to pick a fight. He simply carried himself with steady calmness. Thank you, he said in a clear, even tone. I do have something to say. He placed his folder on the chair beside him, carefully opened it, and pulled out several documents. Then he walked toward the front of the room. The whole hall watched him. The sound of his footsteps somehow louder than usual. He reached the table and placed the documents gently in front of the board president. Think you should look at these, he said quietly. The president, already annoyed by the man's confidence, reached for the papers and scanned the first page. A frown tugged at the corners of his mouth. He flipped to the next page, then another, and his expression began to change. The confidence faded. The color in his face shifted. His pen fell from his hand. What is this supposed to be? The president asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. It's exactly what it says, the man replied. Those are the original county records, the land surveys, and the transfer of ownership documents. They show the legal owner of the lake and the land around it. The entire room leaned forward almost at the same time. It was as if everyone sensed something big was happening. The president looked again at the documents, then looked up with wide eyes. This must be a mistake, he said. It isn't, the man replied. I had them reviewed by a lawyer to be absolutely sure. The lake is not HOA property. It was never HOA property. It was purchased decades ago by a small company. When the company passed to my family, it later passed to me. I've owned the lake this entire time. A wave of whispers exploded across the room. People looked at one another in shock. Several residents gasped under their breath. Some looked angry and odd at the man, but at the board. The president looked lost. He kept flipping through the papers, hoping to find anything that would let him deny what he was seeing. You own the lake? He asked, as if he couldn't believe the words. Yes, the man answered. Every part of it. The water, the shoreline, the walking path around it, all of it is on my deed. One of the board members reached for the papers and started reading them with trembling hands. Another leaned over to see. A third looked so stunned she didn't know how to react. The man continued, speaking calmly so everyone could hear him. You've been charging people fees for access to the lake. Fees that were supposed to go to maintenance. Fees for property you never owned. And then you threatened to ban me from my own land. A silence fell over the hall. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but one thick with tension and shock. People stared at the board members, some with disbelief, others with frustration that had clearly built up over months or even years. The president opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. His voice, usually loud and commanding, now sounded weak when he finally spoke. There must be some misunderstanding. There isn't, the man said softly. I brought the lawyer who helped review everything. He's right outside. The president's head jerked up. You brought a lawyer. Of course, before presenting something like this, I needed to be certain. He can explain the documents if you'd like. The president's eyes darted around the room, suddenly aware that every resident was watching him. He swallowed hard, then nodded hesitantly. A moment later, the lawyer stepped inside, a calm, professional-looking man holding a slim briefcase. He nodded politely to the room, then addressed the board. "I've reviewed the documents thoroughly," he said. "There is no doubt about their authenticity. The lake belongs to this resident. He holds full legal ownership of it and the surrounding land. The HOA has no legal authority over it." The room broke into another wave of shocked whispers. The board members looked like their entire world had shifted. The lawyer continued, speaking evenly. "This means any rules, fines, or restrictions the HOA has imposed regarding the lake are invalid. And any fees collected from residents under the claim of lake ownership were done without legal basis." Several people gasped. Someone in the back muttered quietly, "All these years." Another person whispered, "They made us pay for something they don't own." Faces in the crowd showed frustration, confusion, and even betrayal. These were people who had been charged year after year for something they believed their HOA was responsible for. Now they realized they had been paying blindly for something the board had no right to charge. The president looked pale. His hands were shaking slightly, and he pressed them against the table to steady himself. "This will need further review," he said weakly. "It already has been reviewed," the lawyer replied gently. "The documents stand." The man didn't raise his voice or act triumphant. He simply stood in front of everyone, calm and steady, letting the truth speak for itself. For the first time since he had moved into the neighborhood, people were looking at him not with pity or annoyance or fear of association, but with respect. Some nodded at him. Others gave him supportive looks. A few seemed relieved, as if the control the HOA had held over the community for too long was finally starting to slip. The president tried to regain authority. "Well," he said with a shaky breath, we will need time to reconsider our policies. Perhaps we can schedule another meeting." "There's nothing to reconsider," the man said softly. "You don't own the lake. You can't threaten me for accessing my own land. And you can't fine people for something that doesn't belong to you." The president's mouth opened, then closed again. He seemed like a person who wasn't used to losing control, especially not in front of a room full of people he once intimidated with ease. One resident slowly stood up. "Is it true?" she asked. "The HOA really doesn't own the lake." The man nodded. "Then why did they charge us every year?" Another person asked. No board member answered. Another resident raised his hand. "I paid hundreds of dollars last year alone. And the year before that? And the year before that? What did the money go to?" More murmurs filled the hall, louder this time. People were no longer whispering, they were demanding answers. The board members looked cornered. The president reached for water, but his hand trembled so much he couldn't lift the cup properly. The man didn't want to escalate the tension. He raised his hand slightly to calm the crowd. "I didn't come here to attack anyone," he said gently. "I only came to clear the truth." The board made decisions based on assumptions. Maybe they thought the lake belonged to them because past boards believed the same. "I'm not here to blame anyone." His words softened the room a little. People settled back into their seats, but their frustration did not disappear. It simply became more controlled. "I just want the harassment to stop," the man continued. "The warnings, the false accusations, the threats. I've been silent for weeks, hoping this would end on its own. But it didn't, so I had to show the truth." His calmness made the moment even more powerful. He wasn't angry. He wasn't boasting. He was simply a person who wanted peace in a place that should have been peaceful from the start. The president, still pale, cleared his throat again. We will need to speak privately after the meeting." "I'm fine with that," the man replied. "But everyone deserves to know the truth, and they've heard it now." The residents nodded and murmured in agreement. The room had changed completely. The board no longer felt like the authority. The people did. The fear that hovered over meetings like a heavy cloud was gone. Something different filled the air now. Relief, courage, and a sense that things might finally change. The man returned to his seat, quietly placing the papers back into his folder. The lawyer sat beside him, offering a reassuring nod. The president tried to continue the meeting, but his voice lacked its usual energy. The board members looked down at their notes, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. What was once a display of power now felt more like a group of people scrambling to hold on to authority that was slipping through their fingers. Residents continued asking questions about fees, about rules, about past board decisions. The board answered with difficulty, stumbling through explanations that didn't satisfy anyone. The meeting grew long and tense, but the balance had already shifted. Nobody feared the board anymore. By the time the president announced the end of the meeting, people stayed behind just to talk among themselves. Some walked up to the man to thank him. Others told him how much they admired his patience and courage. He listened kindly, never acting superior or proud. He didn't feel victorious, just relieved. The truth was finally out. The room that once felt heavy and controlled now felt open and honest. This was the turning point the community had needed for a long time, and though he didn't know exactly what the next steps would be, he knew one thing for sure: nothing in that neighborhood would ever be the same again. The HOA's power had cracked, and everyone saw it. The silence they tried to force on him had finally broken, replaced with voices that had been waiting far too long to be heard. The night of the meeting felt long, but the days that followed felt even longer for the community. People had gone home talking about the discovery, replaying the moment when the board president's confidence crumbled right in front of everyone. Some were angry, others confused, but most felt something new: relief. After years of being pushed around, someone had finally stood up to the HOA, and he hadn't done it with shouting or threats. He did it with quiet truth. The man who owned the lake tried to return to his normal routine the next morning. He woke early, made himself a cup of coffee, and stepped onto his back porch overlooking the calm water. The lake always had a peaceful shine at sunrise, a soft reflection that made him feel grounded. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe without pressure on his shoulders, but that peace didn't last long. Within an hour, 3 neighbors knocked on his door. They weren't loud or demanding, they simply wanted to talk. They wanted to thank him. They wanted to admit things they'd never had the courage to say. Some shared how the HOA had fined them unfairly. Others talked about how they were afraid to plant flowers or repaint a porch because the board would complain. One older resident said she hadn't attended HOA meetings for years because they made her feel like a child being scolded. He listened to everyone with patience, offering them a calm place to speak. He didn't promise to fight on their behalf, and he didn't criticize the HOA. He simply listened. And somehow, that made people feel safer than they had in a long time. Later that day, he received a message requesting a private meeting with the HOA board. He wasn't surprised. The board members had looked troubled after the public meeting, and he knew they needed to face the truth head-on. So he agreed. When he arrived at the community hall, the atmosphere was nothing like before. There were no crowded chairs, no whispers, no spotlight shining on the president's confident face. Just a long table and 4 uneasy board members sitting in silence. They asked him to sit. He did. For a moment, no one spoke. The president finally cleared his throat. "Thank you for meeting with us," he said quietly. His voice lacked its usual sharpness. We owe you an apology." The man didn't react with anger or satisfaction. He simply nodded, waiting for them to continue. Another board member spoke up. "We genuinely thought the lake was under HOA jurisdiction. Past records weren't clear, and we followed what previous boards had always said. We never looked deeper." "I understand," the man replied calmly. "Mistakes happen. What matters is what happens next." The board members exchanged tired looks. The president rubbed his forehead, looking much older than he had the previous night. "We want to make things right," the president said. "We've already stopped all lake-related fees. We've paused enforcement of those rules, and we want to discuss how we can move forward with your involvement." The man leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. He didn't want to turn this into a battle. He didn't want control over anyone. He only wanted fairness. I don't want to take anything away from the community, he said gently. People use the lake to relax, walk, fish, or spend time with their families. I'm not going to block anyone from enjoying something peaceful, but I also won't allow harassment or threats toward me or anyone else. The board members nodded quickly, almost desperately. I'm willing to let residents continue using the lake freely, he continued. No fees, no restrictions. I'll even sign an agreement to make that clear. The board looked relieved, but he added, I need something from all of you. Their relief vanished as quickly as it came. I need you to run this HOA fairly, he said. Stop looking for mistakes in people. Stop sending threatening letters for small things. And definitely stop making rules without considering how they affect the community. The president seemed unsure at first, but then he nodded slowly. You're right, he said. We've let things get out of hand. One board member admitted that they had become so focused on enforcing rules that they forgot they were supposed to help the neighborhood, not control it. Another confessed that the constant pressure to keep order had made meetings stressful, even for them. The man listened, then offered something no one expected. I don't want you to resign, he said softly. This isn't about removing anyone. It's about changing the way things are done. People just want to feel heard. The board members looked stunned. They had prepared for anger, maybe a lawsuit, maybe a demand for resignations, but not forgiveness, not kindness. They all agreed to step back, rethink their policies, and work with the community instead of above it. For the first time since he moved in, the man felt like he was talking to reasonable people, not power-hungry enforcers. The meeting ended on a softer note. The man shook their hands, thanked them for listening, and walked out feeling lighter.